You know, I really didn't want to start this week's podcast by saying, during my hiatus, I had this idea for a podcast. But during the summer, Elon Musk made an enemy out of just about everyone. He's saying on Twitter that he wants to take the company private, which was causing all kinds of SEC issues. He called the gentleman that rescued all of those Thai boys in that cave, he called him some kind of pedo dude. And as every public tweet and proclamation came out, dropping his company stock price, I said to myself,
pardon my French, but you're an asshole.
Steve Jobs is another perfect example. We're going to totally get into that. I am not going to belabor the intro. This week's episode, we're talking about tech giants who turn out to be jerks. And why do we love them? I'm Joey Lombardi, and this is SourceCast episode 129. Let's kick it off with Elon Musk. In the summer, Elon Musk wanted to create some kind of submarine device to save the children that were trapped in a cave in Thailand. Not only could Elon not create the submarine device in time, most expert divers stated that because that cave system was so treacherous, it would be completely ineffective. Elon went on to attack Vernon Unsworth, who is the guy who went in and saved these kids. He basically called this guy a pedophile. People were not happy with Elon Musk because of this quote, and he sort of apologized on Twitter, and the situation died down. Until early September, the Tesla CEO wrote an email to BuzzFeed stating, and I quote, "I suggest that you call people you know in Thailand, find out what's actually going on, and stop defending child rapists. You bleeping bleep holes." Elon Musk is essentially saying that this Unsworth fellow moved to Thailand to get involved with some child bride situation. He has no evidence for these claims, and Unsworth denied them. You have a CEO of a publicly traded company calling someone a pedophile who saved children. But then, around the same time, he's publicly stating on Twitter that he may take Tesla private because of all of this public scrutiny and confusion, which resulted in a potential investigation by the SEC, and then magically, he backs off of the whole statement. And then a couple of weeks ago, he created an uproar because he went on Joe Rogan's podcast and apparently smoked weed. And frankly, it has me wondering if all of these public displays of childish behavior is a distraction because Tesla is not meeting their production quotas. While the attention that he is attracting is not positive, it is stopping stories and headlines about his company's inability to produce and meet their goals. I like Tesla as a company. I like what they're doing. I like that there is an electric car option. I don't want to see this company fail. And I really hope that Elon Musk can learn to keep his mouth shut and not negatively impact his company and his stock. Elon is a Boy Scout compared to Steve Jobs. It's pretty easy to find stories and comments about Steve Jobs doing horrible things to people. Jobs popped back into my head because his daughter just recently published a book about their relationship and the way he treated her, especially in the first few years of her life. Lisa Brennan Jobs' book, Small Fry, details that he was an emotionally distant human being. And it took him several years to even acknowledge her as his daughter. And even when he did, he seemed to waver on that position. TheGuardian.com did a review of the book, and it explains a couple of the incidents that happened to Lisa Brennan Jobs during her adolescence. By the way, the article was by Fiona Sturgis. In the book, Lisa Brennan Jobs documents that Steve Jobs could be funny and perceptive, but he was more often condescending and mean-spirited. Apparently, Steve Jobs told people that Lisa wasn't really his daughter, and that his existence in her life was a charity. Apparently, she documented in the book that he would decide not to pay for things at the last minute, and he would walk out of restaurants without paying a bill, and he told his daughter at the age of 9 that she would never get a penny from him. In her teens, she moved in with Steve Jobs because she was having a tough time with her mom, and by this point, Steve Jobs was remarried. He had a wife and a small infant son. And one of the conditions of having his daughter move in was that she didn't speak to her mother for 6 months, and he would chastise the girl when she was involved in extracurricular activities because she wasn't participating in the family. But then apparently he would ignore her for weeks. That sounds like a horrible situation, but there are many leaders and famous people who turn out to be horrible parents. So perhaps he had a better reputation in the business world. You know where I'm going with this. Business Insider has a list of some of the meanest things that Steve Jobs has done to people. I've picked out a few. One of the most jarring that I saw was Steve Jobs fired a team lead during a huge group presentation. Again, according to this Business Insider article, when MobileMe launched in the summer of 2008, it was plagued with problems. The press was slamming this MobileMe implementation. People were saying it was unfinished. So Jobs gathered this Mobile Me team in the Apple auditorium, and he asked, "Can anyone tell me what this thing is supposed to do?" And the team gave a bunch of answers. And he responded, "Then why the bleep doesn't it do any of that?" Then Steve Jobs fired the Mobile Me boss on the spot and replaced him with Eddie Q.
That was cold-blooded!
One of Steve Jobs' best friends, Joni Ive, was asked why Steve Jobs was such a rude person. This was his response, and I quote, "I once asked him why he gets so mad about stuff, and he said, 'But I don't stay mad. He has this very childish ability to get really worked up about something, but it doesn't stay with him at all. But there are other times, I think honestly, when he's very frustrated, and his way to achieve catharsis is to hurt someone, and I think he feels he has a liberty and license to do that. The normal rules of social engagement, he feels, don't apply to him because of how very sensitive he is. He knows exactly how to efficiently and effectively hurt someone, and he does do that.'" Forbes writer David Corsi wrote an article, "Steve Jobs was a jerk, you shouldn't be." Corsi basically says that Steve Jobs did things his way. This was his personality. In fact, Corsi had a not-so-pleasant run-in with Steve Jobs at some point in his career. But he basically lays the framework that you should not try to emulate Steve Jobs and the way he went about doing things because Steve Jobs has a very specific personality. And attempting to emulate someone is not going to work for you if that's not native to what your personality is. He goes on to say that Apple effectively has a mean reputation and is obsessively secret because it is a reflection of Jobs, or it was a reflection of Jobs. It's easy to step back and look at successful people and try to emulate their behavior. But it seems that eventually this negative behavior, the attributes that get these people to the spot that they're in many cases is their downfall. Let's talk about someone who is absolutely riding high at the moment, Jeff Bezos. He's the richest man in the world. His company's worth $1 trillion. This week, he announced a $2 billion fund to finance preschools and help homeless families. This is certainly an action that should be applauded, but there were immediately detractors to this overt act of charity. Fortune.com called out the fact that this homeless family charity is a little too on the nose because Amazon initially pushed back on a Seattle tax that would ultimately help homeless people. Here's a quote from the Fortune.com article by Glenn Fleischman. "Amazon opposed the tax, originally floated at $500 a year for each of its Seattle employees. To signal its displeasure, the company halted construction on a new tower and suggested it might sublet 722,000 square feet it had just leased in a signature downtown building. When the council approved a reduced $275 tax, Amazon restarted construction on the tower. But it joined forces with Starbucks and other local employers to fund a group, No Tax on Jobs." It's also interesting that Jeff Bezos would focus on homeless support, considering his company has a reputation for taking advantage of a migrant homeless population. Amazon employs an elderly, mobile workforce of displaced human beings who lost their homes during the Great Recession, and these people opted to move into campers and RVs. And Amazon goes after this population of people. They bring them in to work at their factories. They call them their camper force, and they have cultivated a cheap workforce that fundamentally has no benefits and are struggling to survive and have shelter and sustenance. It is very telling to see Bezos invest money and time into that particular charity area, considering what he's accused of enabling. TheVerge.com has an article by Casey Newton about Mark Zuckerberg. It's titled, "We Won't Find Out If Mark Zuckerberg Can Fix Facebook by Asking Him." I'm not particularly focused on the Facebook issues of this article, but Casey Newton, towards the end, writes this, and I quote, "There was a time when seeing new interviews with Zuckerberg made me feel jealous, but increasingly, I see the limits of asking tech CEOs questions about their work. A profile of Zuckerberg, or Jack Dorsey, or even Evan Spiegel always seems to be circling around the question, is this person basically a good guy? And for those particular group of individuals," Casey goes on to say, "I suspect that's one reason they sit for profiles like this. They are basically good guys, and a magazine writer who visits them at their home will see this and report it back to the world at large. But lately I find myself less interested in reading tech CEOs perform their thoughtfulness. During the Alex Jones deplatforming drama, I wrote that Twitter's dithering was frustrating because the company so often substitutes thinking for action. Dorsey gave several interviews during this time, and I read them all, and I learned almost nothing. It isn't that the questions were bad or that Dorsey sidestepped them. It's that what he thinks is ultimately less consequential than what he does." So now we've gone full circle. At the start of the podcast, we talk about Elon Musk running his mouth on Twitter and on public media. And the stock is negatively impacted because of his words. Not actions, words. But on the flip side, for these CEOs that have created this life-changing technology, this social media that has influenced elections and overthrown governments, we have this expectation that these people are going to have the most insightful views of the world, but they're just tech nerds that are trying to sell advertising. And when we look to Steve Jobs, and when we look to Mark Zuckerberg for a means on how to approach this new technologically connected world, we get nothing. Because it's not up to them, and it's not on them to tell you how to interact with your life and your world and your social circle. That's on you. I totally get the desire to want to emulate a Steve Jobs, just like people in the 80s wanted to emulate Jack Welch. But what I find is that these quote-unquote business or tech visionaries, they're a product of their times. The strategies that Jack Welch created in the 80s, in his most recent books, he's backing off of those things. His hard-ass approach to getting performance and pushing people out of the companies, now he's writing books saying that people are our most valuable asset. Rah, rah, rah. It would be very interesting to see how Steve Jobs evolved as a human being had he lived. His actions and behavior during the height of his power and fame, they're not commendable. They're not something that people should seek to emulate. And I'm curious to see if he would be remorseful of those things later in life. In the book that his daughter wrote, she stated that he was remorseful for his actions towards her. And she said they had a good ending. And then when you look at Elon Musk, he's a guy who has basically said in the press that he's lonely. He seemed to go off the rails when he broke up with Johnny Depp's ex-wife, Amber Heard. And I kind of feel for the guy. He seems like a lonely guy that says some stupid stuff to get a reaction. And he's trying to be witty, but it's not working. And every time he opens his mouth, the stock drops. David Corsi's advice is right. Don't emulate these people because they're famous or they're rich. They got to a certain place because of their personalities, but their personalities might cannibalize their success. It takes a certain kind of person to rise to the top. Casey Newton's article about Mark Zuckerberg also points out that the things that got Zuckerberg to his position are not necessarily the things that are going to make him successful. He started out as a disruptor, and now he is the establishment. And he fundamentally has to protect the establishment now that he is the establishment, and that's a totally different mindset. So basically what I'm saying is, be nice, don't say crazy things on Twitter, don't be mean to people, especially if they don't deserve it, and don't try to follow the footprints of other people. Forge your own path.
And that's all we have for this week. You can find SourceCast on iTunes, Google Music, and all of your favorite podcasting applications. SourceCast is recorded in Bucolic, Mantua, New Jersey, and it's produced by my dad. The outro is performed by me, Ben Lombardi, and music is provided by Patrick Lee. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week.